It's an old adage, but the first casualty of war is the truth. And even though in 2025 we've ostensibly got more ways of accessing information and sharing the truth than ever, you can see from everything that's happening in Israel and Palestine and between Russia and Ukraine that this remains as true as ever. We're going to look into, from my perspective, what's happening in the Ukraine war and why, contrary to narrative, everything we're seeing could and should have been completely different. It's a war that the Ukrainians ultimately lost in April 2022, and we've just been living out that loss since. Before we get stuck in, thanks so much to my Patreon patrons. If you want to join up and have a say on episodes and get some bonus content, head on over to patreon.com/Endry. Everyone else, I hope you're doing great wherever you are, and please enjoy the episode. Let's go. So today's topic might be a little controversial or confusing because there are so many sources of information that we can go to with this, and so many of them are compromised. And during war, there's just so many incentives for everyone on all sides to, at the very least, obfuscate the truth, but often to outright lie about often the most important details and the most important elements. So I want to start by saying that I think that all wars are total tragedies, and even one person being killed for the aims of states is typically too great a cost to pay for the benefits that are gained, and this war is absolutely no exception. And I hope that none of the conversation directions today appear to take away from the suffering or legitimacy of the people involved in these conflicts. If anything, I hope to do a better job of representing the truth than we typically get on these matters in order to honor the poor suffering and sacrifices that people are making in these arenas, and to honor all of us as people so that we may do a better job of understanding why breakdowns occur and the narratives that enable them to continue. And we can do all we can to avoid subsequent breakdowns and further escalations in the future. So the core premise that we're looking into is that Ukraine lost the war in April 2022, which is an inflammatory thing to say in some senses because it is an ongoing war, which means that there are contested elements and that people are still trying to quote unquote win. Let's start by saying that nobody wins in a war. It's almost never the case in modern times that people are defending their homeland from barbarians and have to stand and defend their way of life. I mean, there's elements of that are true, but the overarching reasons for wars that occur are almost always to do with geopolitical machinations that have nothing to do with the people that are fighting them, in that people that kill and die are not the ones making the decisions, and their interests are not represented, and it's in fact quite often the opposite of the case, where their interests are badly hurt by those pushing tanks around on a board. The one thing that always strikes me in wars is that the two people that are fighting each other across a trench have far more in common with each other inevitably than they do with the people who are ordering them to go and fight each other. So before we go into why April 2022, might be good to have a refresher on the events so far. So if you only read ABC News, you might think that this war started in February 2022 when the Russians marched into Kiev with their row of tanks and the truck convoy and the attempt to overthrow the state. But in fact, Ukraine's been at war with at least itself and the proxy version of Russia since 2014, where there was a revolution that overthrew the Ukrainian government that was immediately rejected by some provinces in the east, in the Donbass. They didn't want to accept the result, declared independence, and have been at war with the Ukrainian state ever since. They're backed by the Russian state to do that. And of course, the Russian state itself in that same period marched into and occupied Crimea. So Ukraine hasn't been whole as it was created in 1991 since 2014, as Russia has continuously occupied Crimea since then. And there's been this proxy war between the breakaway regions in the east, fueled by the Russians, and the Ukrainian state since. As worth mentioning this, not to say that one side is more valid than the other, but just that the war has been an ongoing feature of that part of the world for that period of time. And already 10,000 citizens had been killed in that war leading up to the Russian invasion of 2022. There have been numerous attempts to resolve this because nobody wants to have a war on their doorstep, and they were unsuccessful. There were the Minsk agreements, but those were subsequently identified by the participants, Angela Merkel and others, as just being excuses to buy Ukraine time to arm so that they could defend their territory rather than to resolve the differences between Russia's security interests and the Ukrainian security interests. And when the war did start, I made a prediction that was shockingly wrong. I said to myself and to others that it would for sure be over within 2-3 months, because the odds were just stacked so heavily against the Ukrainians. Despite having been bolstered by the West for a decade in terms of material and training, they still remained. They had something like 10% the number of Russian tanks, Russian air force, 20% of its population. And of course, Russia's a nuclear power, which Ukraine isn't. Ukraine is a very corrupt society. It was before the war. It's even worse now. And its GDP per capita is something like a third of that of Russian. So it's a poor society, not enough people, not enough material, even though they're very strong and defending their homeland, which is a big advantage. Plus, you have an advantage as a defender in war anyway. Despite those things, because the initial starting conditions made it clear, once US troops were not going to be committed, or once European troops were not going to be committed directly, it's only a matter of time until they lose. And where I was wrong is obviously it's 3 years now and the war is tragically still going. And what I didn't account for at the time, and I can't believe I didn't, because I consider myself a student of history, is the irrationality of people and war and leadership and the nature of accountability, whereby the people who make the decisions are not the people who suffer the consequences. So yes, okay, all those things can be true and it can be an inevitable path to losing, but as long as the people who make the decisions are still winning from the circumstances or have some incentive to continue, all the people responsible can be convinced that the ocean is orange and the sky is yellow or whatever. As long as it remains humans that are in charge of these processes, there's no limit to the depths of stupidity and irrational behavior that we see. Very few of the actors who were involved in World War I foresaw what it would become or would have chosen it if they could. And of course, in hindsight, you could pick any day after the start of World War I in which all parties, had they known what would occur, would have made the decision not to do it. But that's just not how these things work. So here we are a few years on. But there was one critical window, which is what we're going to talk about a bit today, where the Ukrainians and the Russians almost reached a peace agreement at the very beginning of the conflict. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but because those initial conditions were so obvious, the Ukrainians and the Russians were meeting early on in the conflict and trying to find a way to resolve it and to meet their mutual needs. I want to be very clear that I'm not making any value judgment on the validity or otherwise of any of the claims and the needs that these parties have in this conflict. I'm not trying to present what I think should happen, other than to say that it's interesting that there have been roads to peace that have not been taken. And it's really important that I think we understand why that's the case, because they're not well presented in the public narratives of what's occurring. I'm going to talk a lot about the lies that have defined this conflict in this episode. And I think it follows on nicely from the conversation a few weeks ago, because you can really see how the unintended consequences of small lies or big lies really do pave a way to hell and make it difficult to solve the problems that are in front of us. So just a month or so into the conflict, Russia and Ukraine met in Istanbul with international arbiters to try and find the terms for an immediate ceasefire and then a medium-term peace. And it's a little murky because these are private negotiations, and also it's complex in a way that I could spend this entire episode just talking about these instances and still miss major elements. But in a nutshell, they met, negotiated a bunch of key terms, and had a soft agreement to the extent that documents were initialed and they were prepared to move forwards towards a ceasefire. And then, for a number of reasons, both parties walked away radically and haven't been that close to repairing ever since. I like to imagine certain individual exceptional events from history as lightning flash moments, which is, it's dark, but then there's one flash, and for a very brief moment, you can see everything and measure the trajectory and see how things are actually done. And then we return to darkness. And this is one of those for me, because there are a lot of players who don't have any incentive to lie at all, who were a party to these negotiations, that report on them and give an idea of what occurs that should be alarming for us all, because there's a substantial element of these negotiations that were abandoned by the Ukrainians due to pressure from the West to continue fighting under the pledge that they would be given unlimited weapons and financial support to continue the war. And where I say non-interested parties, it's not the Russians that are claiming this. It's not even Ukrainians that have fallen out of favor that are claiming this. Naftali Bennett, who's a former prime minister of Israel, he played a large role in those negotiations. And in an interview, he claimed that Russia and Ukraine were willing to make major concessions to end the conflict until pressure from then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson convinced Zelensky to back down from such a deal. And I'm not sure if you remember at the time, but there was a heavily circulated footage of Boris walking the streets of Kiev with Zelensky as a kind of savior. And knowing now that in those conversations, he was saying, don't sign any ceasefire, keep fighting, essentially keep fighting a war that without additional manpower, they are a very, very, very low chance of winning, I think should be considered a war crime. If not a war crime, at least there should be some mechanism of accountability. So in addition to the claims of Naftali Bennett, there's also a Ukrainian parliamentary representative who was at the talks, David Arkamia, and he made a similar claim. David asserts that the key consideration for the Russians was just that Ukraine didn't join NATO, so that they would remain neutral in military alliances. And so he says, they were hoping almost to the end to put pressure on us to sign such a document and accept neutrality. It was a big deal for them, he said in November 2023. They, the Russians, were ready to end the war if we, like Finland once did, would accept neutrality and pledge not to join NATO. In fact, that was the main point. All the rest are cosmetic and political additions. Now, all the rest here refers to whether or not Ukraine joins the EU, what happens to the territories that Russia is occupying within the war, what happens to Crimea, all these other additional things. So they're claiming that they were willing to walk away back to the pre-February 2022 borders in terms of territorial control in exchange for Ukraine not joining NATO. Where do we sit now? We're in 2025, 3 years on. Ukraine is still not in NATO. It looks like they will not be able to join NATO despite all the rhetoric. They're not in the European Union. Also looks like they won't be able to join that despite the rhetoric. They have lost more territory since that time, but critically, they've lost seemingly more than 10 million civilians from their society that may never come back. They've lost potentially 1 million plus soldiers as casualties to the war. They've lost much more of their country, and under the buckling weight of a war that is ongoing, they stand to lose more every single day, and who knows where that ends should the front lines collapse. Bad situation. They've also lost their civil society. This is also something that's underreported, but early on in the war, Zelensky banned some 19 opposition political parties. They've lost their free press. It's basically been an ongoing loss in the sense that any war is. And it's not like Russia has won. I want to be very clear. This war is not a win for Russia either to be fighting. They've lost hundreds of thousands of their troops. They've had to gear their society to a full war economy. They've lost international reputation across the entire West and are subjected to some 19 packages of EU sanctions. Nobody wins in a war. They, like Ukraine, have to now live with a neighbor that's permanently poisoned against them for decades. But for those of us who were asserting that Ukraine could win at the beginning, we have to unpack, what does winning mean? For Ukraine, at that time, it meant expelling a Russian army of 150,000 plus people. There was just no way that they could do that. Give them all the Western support, give them all the material, intelligence, whatever. It's very hard to move 200,000 Russians from your country that's right next to Russia and has strong supply lines. What's more, the dynamics of escalation have meant that the more increasingly advanced material or intelligence or terrorist attacks have been planned from the Ukrainian side onto the Russians, that just has led to a commensurate escalation from the Russian side. And the core mechanics of everything I described at the beginning don't change. Russia is a much larger and richer society with more industrial production, a higher population, and a greater incentive to stay involved than Ukraine's Western backers. And the poor Ukrainians are just grist to the mill of some horrible decision-making here. And it's a nightmare that's ongoing. So I want to reiterate here so we could take a moment to reflect. There was an opportunity in end of March, early April 2022, 3 years ago, just months after the outbreak of the conflict, for a ceasefire to be signed that would have required no additional loss of territory and only that Ukraine not join NATO, the organization that they were already not in. Now, instead, we are looking at a far, far worse set of terms because that war has continued, and the sort of sunk cost fallacy in thinking where, now Russia has invested all this into the war, then they're not going to be interested in walking away from a war that they're winning to accept terms that are worse or on par with the ones that they were pushing for 3 years ago. Now they're going to take territory, and now they're going to call for more things. It's a disaster for the Ukrainian state, and who's held responsible? Again, I didn't even mention, there's no elections in Ukraine. Zelensky's presidential term ended in May, I think, 2024, but due to the martial law, there's suspended elections, so there's no democratic mechanism to have the perspective of what the people may want expressed in any way. It's poison stacked on poison. And we really should know better because we've played these same games of trying to construct the state that we want and divide people how we wish them to be. And we here, I mean the West, we played these same games in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam. We keep losing. It's not a winning proposition, but it is a winning proposition for the Americans who are able to sit at home and have their arms companies' value go up and up and up. It is a winning proposition for world leaders who get to parade around and moralize and feel like they're Winston Churchill. It's just the nightmare for the people who are living with all the consequences, which is absolutely who should be at the center of any decision making that occurs in these realms. And if you don't read a lot about this conflict, or you're sort of just catch the headlines, you might be surprised to hear how heavily I'm talking about the war as one between the West and Russia, with Ukraine in the middle. And it's because very much, whilst it is presented as Russia versus Ukraine and Ukraine's nobly defending their homes, which is absolutely all true, the missing shadow is that none of this would have been enabled or empowered without the support from the West. The West has been providing nonstop military aid, as in all the bullets that are being fired, all of the guns that are there, all of the intelligence that they use, the bases, the training. It's all completely enabled by NATO-based powers, most notably, obviously, the US as financial backers. And so the Ukrainian state, which was predicted to collapse within a few days and very nobly didn't, but it would be gone in a week from now without the support continuing. For instance, since the start of the conflict, we the West have given an estimated $250 billion to Ukraine. And for context, you could run the entire Fijian state for 150 years or something with that same amount of money. So it's astonishing. Without that aid, Ukraine collapses. They can't pay their soldiers. They can't pay their pensions. They can't run their schools. Not to mention that modern militaries are completely dependent upon intelligence and advanced equipment, and that all of that is coming directly via the CIA and US military intelligence. And the equipment itself is just coming in trains from Poland, from Germany, from Romania. In fact, I caught a train from Prague to Budapest in June last year, and coming into Hungary, I was shocked at the border to see rows for like probably 5 minutes of the train going past of just armored military vehicles with French insignia on the side that were all on their way to that conflict. And in fact, Australia just sent $250 million worth of Abrams tanks this week. I think it's 49 tanks or something like that. So the West are very much a party to enabling this war. And the funny thing of that Western backing is it kind of occurs under a moral imperative, because we need to support the victim and we need to support justice and democracy and truth. And all of those ideas that are held up as shields mask us from the reality that this support is actually just something that fuels a fire to continue. And that fire is burning up all the men of Ukraine, and all the towns of the front, and all the people in their lifestyles, and that whole society. And the costs are bad now, but they're only going to be ongoing into the coming decades as there's sort of any effort to recover and rebuild in the wake of whatever disaster is left at the end of this. So it's one of those cruel ironies, a fatal flaw, where the very thing that you think you are preventing is the very thing that you're causing. Because the main problem with this support, and it's been true since the start, is that it's not sustainable without winning. So unless Ukraine is able to either make a deal that gets all the Russians out, or to physically push out the Russian armies from their territory, at some point something will give. And I think by now it's clear that they're not going to win the war on the battlefield. So what is it that's going to give? Is it the Russians, who are significantly better resourced and fighting what they perceive to be an existential war with their larger capacities and larger manpower? Or is it the Ukrainians, who are smaller, losing, and completely dependent upon the political whims of their Western backers to survive? I wouldn't want my local football team to be dependent upon the mood of Donald Trump or the conscientiousness of Keir Starmer. Or to gamble an entire statehood on it and the well-being of all the people therein is madness.
There have been so many lies in and around this war that it's kind of hard to know where to begin or what level of detail to go into. And it's such a minefield that it probably warrants its own episode in the aftermath of it all, which will hopefully be soon, my goodness. But yeah, as I mentioned, I think following on from the episode about lying a few weeks ago and the sort of civilizational level consequences and how unknowable they can be, it's definitely worth diving into a few of the big ones. And for me, probably the first major and obvious one is one that you hear everywhere and told as fact when it's quite a risky one. And that is that Putin is Adolf Hitler reincarnated, in that he's hell-bent on conquering Ukraine and then going on to conquer the rest of Europe. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin is responsible for the war, in the sense that Russia is the active partner in the escalation that occurred in February 2022. But even the claim that he wants to occupy Ukraine is one that you could make a good case to contest. And the claim that is going to move on and conquer anywhere else in Europe is brazen to put with certainty. But it's no joke or exaggeration. It's almost every day that a major European leader will come to echo some form of this. The leaders of France and the UK, President Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Keir Starmer, pretty routinely state that they need to prepare their countries for war with Russia. And Friedrich Merz of Germany is the same, and many other European leaders. They earnestly look to their populations and say, we need to pivot our society to a war footing because war with Russia, direct war with Russia is coming, as though it's something out of their control. Now, for the UK and France, notwithstanding the fact that they're all nuclear powers, which means the war between them would mean mutual annihilation, it's hard to even say with a straight face how they would find themselves waging a conventional war. It's, let's look it up. It's 2,600 kilometers from Paris to Kiev. And the Russians haven't been able to close the 100 kilometers or whatever it is between their army and Kiev since 2022. Do we really believe that they're going to go through all of Europe and get to France and find themselves fighting on the ground against French? It's a ludicrous claim. But it's off the back of that claim that Europe's currently borrowing 800 billion euros to have a sort of war fund to build up an army. And what are the consequences of that? Like, you can't even know. One haunting and not unrealistic risk of it is that we're at the precipice of a bunch of European countries flipping to have hard right governments in a sort of backswing of politics here. What does that look like if we've just armed every state in a way that's sort of unprecedented for the last 50 years? I can't guess, but I wouldn't imagine that it's a positive idea. And again, the sort of uninterrogated and undemocratic decision to do all that spending and militarism off the back of a sort of boogeyman that's really sort of shadowboxing. I'm not saying that the threat of war isn't real and shouldn't be prepared for, but the presumption that the UK is going to need to go to war with Russia is, well, let's just say I hope it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's certainly far from guaranteed. It's hard to think of anything in Russia's strategic interests that would warrant war with the UK. It's almost absurd to be saying it, but that is pushing back against a very, very common narrative that you see. But even with that sort of major lie and what the consequences of that could be aside, the case that Putin wants to conquer even just Ukraine, the country that they're currently at war with, is, I would say, on shaky ground. Because Vladimir Putin, for all his faults, he's not an idiot. And what occupying all of Ukraine would entail is, I guess, you think you're seeing a big war now. If all of Ukraine was under Russia, it would be full-scale insurrection and having your hand in a beehive, kind of constant nightmares that they couldn't maintain. That if you were to look at the wars of occupation that have been fought in the past, the commitment of troops and munitions, they're very different to what Russia has been doing. As someone who enthusiastically learns about history, it's painful for me to see how easily and quickly and willingly its shorthands are betrayed. Another major trick narrative that you keep seeing invoked in this war is that of appeasement that compares the world making a deal now with Russia in its invasion with Ukraine to the Neville Chamberlain making a deal with Hitler in Munich in 1938. The implication, of course, being that you're dealing with a madman who's hell-bent on conquering everybody via the sword, and you're doing a deal with them now is a moral compromise against all the blood that's going to be shed later. And I find this a very spurious claim. People don't learn much about history, and so the few things that you know are very easy to be leveraged against you as anchors, as though there's only a few truths. When in reality, this war is much more like the Vietnam War, where we were told exactly the same thing. We were told if we allow Vietnam to fall to communism, then the whole of Southeast Asia will fall. And as a result, we need to send all the efforts that we can to stop that from happening because it will save a world war. What ended up happening? Well, we actually lost that war, we being the West, and Vietnam fell to communism quite nicely, and that was the end of that. Turns out the conflict was much more about national autonomy. And so I'm not picking sides in the Vietnam War, but I think we can all agree that it was a tragedy and a huge waste of life, and with ongoing consequences even today, both for the personnel that served, of course, their families, and for the physical landscape. I think 15% of Vietnam was permanently deforested by Agent Orange or something like that. Horrible stuff. And, we're going to see the same thing today, where so much of Ukraine is going to be a wasteland for minefields and depleted uranium ammunition, and who knows what other horrible stuff's being done there. with all of our money and in all of our names. This, for me, much better represents that type of situation, which is a war that's dragging on. People are dying on both sides needlessly, and at some point there'll be some ugly resolution. It feels much more like that than the case that Russia, a country with its own problems that, as has been highlighted, is it's not like they've done a blitzkrieg and overtaken all of Ukraine very quickly. It's pretty implausible that they're going to go move on from fighting in a few regions of Ukraine to fight the combined might of nuclear-armed NATO. It's incredible how many people are saying that with a straight face. But not just people, major leaders of the world, and of course, predictably of NATO. And I think it speaks to the incentivization for all of these people to have that narrative, because it does raise their station or allow them to mobilize resources for whatever it is they want, or allow them directly to get paid, et cetera, et cetera. So no surprises there. But the surprise for me is that we could all be taken along for the ride and there isn't some sort of mechanism of democratic pushback. Yeah, and I guess that's why it's important to be talking about this. This goes on to the second big lie that's an alarming one to me, and that is the claim that's been made in many formal channels by many world leaders, which is that Putin is waging a war against the Ukrainian people that's tantamount to genocide. There's no doubt that war is tragic, and there's no doubt that there's horrible civilian costs associated with it. But any student of the history of wars will see that the civilian death toll in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is surprisingly low compared to historical equivalents. I'm not trying to belittle the very genuine suffering that's occurring and the tragedies of the very real civilian deaths that are ongoing in this conflict. But even just to look at the ratio of civilians to soldiers that are dying in Israel's war against quote unquote Hamas / the people of Gaza, it's astonishing. I think it took only a few months for the Israelis to kill more civilians in Gaza than were killed along thousands of kilometers of front line in the Russia-Ukraine war in years. And this may seem like a small distinction that doesn't really matter, or it might seem like, oh, it's a legitimate thing to raise concern about by using this type of language. But the problem with lying is you can't know the consequence of your lies, but they can become very bad very quickly. And I think in this instance, the lie that we've been repeatedly told by world leaders and global institutions that Russia is performing a genocide of Ukrainians has the consequence that the concept of genocide and war crimes, which have undoubtedly occurred, they become distorted and diluted to the point that we're not able to effectively communicate and mobilize around actual genocides that are occurring, as with Israel's war on the people of Gaza. And another obvious consequence of this, I hope it's not too trivial to put a personal example to this, but if you've ever known somebody who is sort of a naughty boy or a ruffian or whatever at school, and you were friends with them, if they were treated by people in their surroundings as though they were naughty and wrong and bad, then it kind of gave them extra license to be bad because they're already seen that way in any case. So they're already paying the consequences in one sense. So why not be bad? And that's one really big risk here, I think, because if the Russia-Ukraine war escalates further to the degree that Russia decides, for whatever strategic reason, to punish the Ukrainian people directly by doing things that they're accused of, like intentionally bombing civilian sites to squeeze people or whatever it might be, the social consequences of that have kind of already been paid for them. So the incentives for them not to do that have been lowered. And I worry about that quite a lot. If you've looked at wars through history, things can get a lot worse for the people in Ukraine very quickly, as bad as they are now. And you only need to see the suffering that's occurring in Gaza to get a contemporary understanding of that scale. If you read anything of these exact same cities from World War II or World War I, there's a lot more dissent to be risked, and it's not worth risking. The position that I hold on this is an outlier one, often leads to difficult conversations, and it's so frustrating how deep the root of the good versus evil narrative is when my motivation in thinking about better ways to navigate this stuff all surrounds ending war and suffering. But once good versus evil is invoked, people just want to see hell unleashed upon the moral transgressor and are blind to the actual cost. I don't think most people today would conceive of what's occurred in the last few years as a tragedy that's been inflicted upon the Ukrainian people by Russia, of course, but also by the West, in how it's played out in a way that it hasn't needed to. And it really does, for me, go back to that very stark lightning moment, which is there was an opportunity to achieve peace on more favorable terms than are going to be achieved now, but being encouraged, potentially being instructed to walk away from that has directly led to horrors and nightmares for so many that could have been prevented. And you would think that valuing the prevention of that would be perhaps the highest order or perhaps the highest function of a state. But, time and time again, we can see that it's not. And the responsibility falls upon us to have good understanding of what's actually occurring so that in our own little windows, we can represent and express that. And hopefully, pixel by pixel, move to a world where it's absurd to try and get away with that, where people can't stand up and say, to achieve peace, we need to incinerate people with armies. Or it's implausible for people to stand up and say, these particular people are evil and must be killed. Foolishly, I didn't think it would be the type of thing you'd have to say in 2025, but maybe one of the joys of doing this podcast weekly is I can come back in 40 years and say, I can't believe that I thought it was foolish in 2025 when we're still saying the same thing. A smaller lie, but no less an important one, is the morality tale that we're looking at a case of clear good versus clear evil. And the risk of this one is that you get that sort of halo effect where all of the actions on the side of good are justified or justifiable, and all of the actions taken by the bad side are evil and unjust. And it stops moving the parties closer to each other to be able to resolve the conflict and find genuine middle ground and compromise for peace, and leans increasingly upon military outcomes, which take longer and are more horrible to achieve. But also it blinds you to critical thinking and understanding what's occurring in any particular instance. So, I've told the story on this podcast before of my exchange with the Australian diplomat who said that Australia has to be involved defending the country that's had its sovereignty challenged, as though it's an inherent good. And this really irks me at the time, not only because it's a lie, but because it's an insultingly bold one. You could look at so many instances where this hasn't been the case. Like, has Australia mobilized its troops to protect the sovereignty of Syria against Israeli incursion? Of course not. Did we send troops, money, aid, anything to halt the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 and 2024? I doubt most of us have even heard of it. We, Australians, as always, just do whatever the Americans tell us. And if the diplomat had just said that to me, I wouldn't have minded it at all, because there are doubtless good reasons that we do that. But to lie here, it sort of adds a moral valence to our behavior that simply isn't there. And why does this matter? Well, it's exactly the same moral valence that is very likely a key part of the nightmare recipe that's empowering the IDF to commit its genocide against the people of Gaza. And it's the same moral valence that compels a shocking number of Western leaders not only to tolerate, but in many instances actively support that genocide. Because once you decide that you're good and someone else is evil, and that everything your team does is in the right, the depths of how willingly blind you can be to facts in the face of that are, I guess, bottomless. Historically, if you look at people and the cognitive dissonances that we can hold, and how collective societies seem to have a sort of mass psychosis around hating on a certain group or venerating your own. Yeah, I really recommend in this reading Umberto Eco's Inventing the Enemy, if you're unlike me and can actually stop looking at your phone for 10 minutes to read a book. The more I look at these situations where we do have big divides and justify and venerate the killings that are on our side and fail to scrutinize our own team's role in the degeneration of peace into war, the more confident I am that it is our proclivity to find difference and mobilize against it that is the enemy, far more than the actual differences between any given people or their societies. I guess it's put more simply by Howard Zinn, who declared that war itself is the enemy. And while that's always been true in one sense, it's more starkly true than ever, because we can very casually go up the escalation ladder. Even if it takes years in our individual experience, that's a blink in history. If we manage to go up the escalation ladder to have a full-out nuclear exchange, there's any number of small incidents that could occur in this current war that would lead to that, whether by design or by raw error and bad luck. And the more we roll those dice, the more inevitably we approach that outcome, which I hope is one that we all share as something to be avoided. It's not inevitable that we would be in this position, but it's certainly predictable. So then what do we do? Like, what do we do with this bind? Well, I think socially we talk about the reality of it, because there's some sort of shifting baseline annulment where we just get used to these sorts of disasters, because it's easy to look at the relatively stagnant front line and the slow moving updates of exceptional news and to think that not that much is happening in the war. But Ukraine today is a fundamentally different state to the one that Russia invaded in February 22. Because it's an ongoing thing, we sort of become used to it. And the urgency to solve it dissipates. And to think that all of these deaths since that Boris Johnson intervention could have been prevented. They didn't have to happen. And both Ukraine and Russia could have easily achieved a more favorable outcome for both of them. It's hard to know what to do with something that big. I guess you just file it in one of those tragedies of history.
but we are still living in it now. So I think we owe it to ourselves and each other to use more truthful language in describing the disaster. And it's not just because truth is some higher virtue, but seeking it where possible here enables us to know what to do to help the people that are suffering now in this situation and how best to proceed. So the really frustrating thing for me as an onlooker for this in the last few years has been how few of the participants seem to understand the role of dynamics in decision making. And what I mean by that is at each inflection point, people have traded the existing reality as though that is permanent and then made decisions against that as though those decisions don't subsequently have a flow on effect. So to give an example, a couple of years ago, the conversation was for the West, in order to give Ukraine a good position at the negotiating table, they need to do a bit better in the war and perhaps even take some Russian territory so that they've got something to negotiate to get their own territory back. And that sounds well and good if you think that that's the end point of the exchange. But of course, the obvious consequence of Ukraine invading Russia and taking territory, which they did in the Kursk region, is that that prompts an escalation from Russia. And these dynamics, for some reason, don't seem to be considered at each of these inflection points where the conversation might be to give a lot of weapons to Ukraine, or the conversation might be to give long-range missiles to strike Russia, or to give the F-16 jets, or whatever it is. Like, it's all well and good if you are in a static world, but we don't live in a static world. And so these escalations are at every turn met by a counter escalation at the Russian end. And this is a tedious game to watch in one sense because it's non-transformative in terms of the result. The front has been gradually eroding for Ukraine. So it's not like they're quote unquote winning, nor do they have the capacity to. They have far fewer people, as mentioned. They don't have time on their side in any sense because they're completely dependent upon Western backers who, for various political reasons, will waver eventually. And so, whereas for Russia, I mean, this is their doorstep. They're there for the long haul. They're the big power. The escalation for them, as they've stated, is not going to be limited. If they see this as an existential threat, they can push all the way up to using their 5,000 nuclear weapons. And that should be alarming for any onlookers in any instance when any step is taken, even 1 inch towards that outcome. It's a risk you just don't want to take because the stakes are so high. But yet that's one that across the entire political spectrum, from the Greens in Germany to the right-wing parties in other countries, and everywhere in between, you see support for these steps. So it's not even an ideological thing. It just seems to be an irrationality, a sort of mass psychosis or something. And this, annoyingly, was not only really predictable, but was actively predicted. George Kennan, who was the lead diplomat for the US into the Soviet Union, he was a signing party to the foundation of NATO and ambassador to the Soviet Union. He died some 20 years ago, but he wrote at an early stage of NATO expansion. He was in despair because for him, it was seeing his life's work undone. He said, if America puts itself in a position, and the West and NATO puts itself in a position where we're threatening Russia, we only lose because we're not going to care about it as much as them. If we move to their doorstep, they're going to continually escalate to the point at which we get bored or, don't want to invest in it anymore, because for them, it's a core interest. For us, it's a luxurious expansion. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, and the losers, the poor Ukrainians, their losses are ongoing and immeasurable, not just because we don't know what the consequences of this stuff is over time and how many decades or centuries it takes to recover. And of course, that's just in the abstract state level stuff. At the individual level where people are dying, that's the end. I live in an area where there are Ukrainian women that have lost their partners to the war, times that by 1 million, and more than 1 million because of all the people that are affected by these types of deaths. It's a tragedy, and it's a game that didn't need to be played. It is one that absolutely is not worth playing. And yet, once it starts, you have that sort of shifting baseline where we're all used to it now. We're like every week, 1,000 people will die or 2,000 people will die in this war. And if that happened in a single day, it would be a news headline. If a gas main explosion killed 200 people in Sydney today, we'd have national mourning and it would make the news everywhere. But another 1,000 people in a situation that's already been started, it doesn't even scratch the side of our consciousness. So it's a really unmitigated disaster. There are so few voices in the world that have been pushing for its end. There's only piecemeal token stuff because it remains that there are people that are profiting massively from it, and the people who are in charge are not the ones paying the price. It's not like Zelensky's family is at the front. Certainly not Donald Trump's. He sends another 1,000 crates of weapons. He doesn't notice anything except for the stock price going up for Northrop Grumman. The same at Vladimir Putin's end. And so it continues. All those deaths don't land at his door. What does land at his door is Russia getting closer to achieving its state aims in the conflict. So in one sense, it's easier for them all to continue than it is to end. And the reality for all other parties is just total catastrophe. And I've always found it hard that we have examples of the International Criminal Court or the Nuremberg trials where people are held to account for these outcomes. But in the more abstract way that, say, Boris Johnson flying to Ukraine and saying, fight, 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 don't give it up, we'll back you all the way. That's a direct one-to-one lever switch moment that has resulted in the catastrophe that we have today. And who on earth is calling for Boris Johnson, of all people, to be held accountable for this? I've never heard it anywhere, but they should be. Like, they really should be. If we want to have a world in which we can avoid these outcomes, then this behavior needs to be punished. I mean, I couldn't pay my neighbor $2 million to kill somebody else and then stand in court and say, well, it had nothing to do with me. I didn't do it. I just suggested it and paid for it. And in the same way, we need people to be held accountable for the death and destruction that comes via states. Will it ever happen? It's hard to see. It's hard to see it happening, by at least connecting the ideas out loud. That's a foundational place where it might at least enter the imagination space. So we're left with a situation where the war is still going. They're fighting now, but it does start to feel like an end is near, not because everybody is so excited about hippie ideals of peace, but because it's now increasingly clear as a trend what should have been clear and was clear 3 years ago, which is that the Ukrainian state can't sustain this effort and that the front lines are at least non-zero risk of collapse. And just every month that it goes on, the deal that they will inevitably have to make to end the war is going to get worse. We were looking at April 22. At that point, it wasn't even a conversation about losing territory in the way that it is now, where they're going to lose a fifth of their country, if not more. It could well be much more this time in a few months. But at some point, it will end. It'll be, as commentators like John Mearsheimer say, it'll be an ugly victory for Russia, in that they've had to pay a huge price and lost a lot of people in this war. But it's a disaster for the Ukrainian state, and it's hard to see what can happen next in terms of a legitimate architecture of a civil society, let alone what security apparatus can exist sustainably there for them. These are open questions, but yes, it's a catastrophe at every level. It's a catastrophe for the state, and then at the human level, disaster and the ultimate price for too many. And when you see situations like this, you can sort of throw up your hands and say, what do we do? Well, at the very least, and I hope I'm doing my tiny pixel of responsibility in this, at the very least, we can learn from it and work with sort of an intellectual honesty to try and understand what has occurred so that we can better position ourselves to avoid these same mistakes in the future. As a student of history, I wouldn't be that optimistic about it, but if we can even slightly reduce one conflict in the future, who knows how many lives that saves, and that's worth doing.
Love and safety to you wherever you are. I hope that your life is never directly touched by any of this, and that you have the capacity to go out and express whatever it is that you understand peace to be. Sorry, this has been quite a bleak essay, but I think it's an important one. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. And I really thank you very much if you have listened to the end. And if you think it's a useful conversation to have with other people, please consider sending it to them. Hopefully, I'll pick a more cheerful topic from the ones suggested next week. I think I'm going to have to do something a little lighthearted after this.
The equal winners, I'll just bring them up, were the psychos that walk among us. I think the EU might collapse. Proof that Australia is still just a colony. And the invisible trades we have all made but would never choose. If you did want to participate in any of the polls, head over to patreon.com/Andrew. That poll's still live if you want to head on over there and tip the scales. I'm probably leaning towards proof that Australia is still just a colony at the moment because that's a fun one. But hopefully they're all fun. You let me know what you think.
And more broadly, if you like the podcast, you know exactly what to do. The tiny stuff, the reviews, the likes, the shares, they add up massively to me. And I can't say that without saying thank you so much to my patrons for their ongoing support. If you want to join up, patreon.com/Andrew.
I cannot tell you how much of a difference it makes to leverage this ship out into the ocean so I can do a lot more of them, which I love. All right. Hope you have a wonderful week. Take care out there.